Hello, my name is Kristina Olson, and I'm at George Mason University in the state of Virginia, and I have the pleasure of talking today about Inferno 3 with my colleague, Deborah Parker.
Hello, everyone. Welcome, Dante lovers. Kristina's already introduced me, so I don't have to state my name. I'm at the University of Virginia. So Kristina, what is it about this canto that's always struck you? What resonates with you?
Well, there are many things about this canto that strike me. I'm certainly the fact that these sinners are not located within one of the circles of hell, the idea that they're in the entryway, they're kind of stuck there, right, in the vestibule of hell. And so that means that the sin, so to speak, of cowardice, which isn't really technically a sin, but the state of being a coward is such that it doesn't merit you a location within one of the circles of hell. It seems like a very extreme take on cowardice by the poet for me, and that's always stuck out to me. That's one of the things that sticks out to me. How about you?
Well, it is unusual I think this is a big surprise. One doesn't expect the first thing that the first souls that one encounters in hell are neutrals, cowardly individuals, pusillanimous souls who in life didn't take a position. And one of the most wondrous aspects of the Inferno is the way how deeply Dante clearly thought about sin and how many categories there are. No previous conceptions of hell included the sin of neutrality. But I guess one of the things that has always struck me are just the opening lines. They are often in contemporary translations. We often use an English translation. The first 9 lines are set off in capital letters, and the message is really forbidding. Per me si va per la città dolente, per me si va nell'eterno dolore, per me si va tra la perduta gente, giustizia mosse il mio autofattore. And just looking over those lines again, one thing that just struck me is that the repetition of dolore in the first 2 lines, and the way in which throughout the canto, Dante picks up on different words that are that are written in the inscription over hell. One other thing that struck me as a little peculiar, and that is, we know that the damned arrive on the shores of the Aqua. They're all waiting there, and the ferryman is going to ferry them across. They don't actually arrive outside the gate of hell. And it made me wonder who that gate is for, since it doesn't appear that the damned arrived there. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
It is interesting. It's almost as if the gate and the inscription are more for the pilgrim, right, in one sense, so that that we can actually, he can, right, read what is written there. But then also for what Virgil says, right, after, looking at this gate, which is, okay, Dante, pilgrim, you're going to need to leave behind all of your fear. And he uses the word cowardice. You have to leave your cowardice behind now, right? So, I feel like it, obviously it serves a narrative function. It is meant to impress upon the reader where we are and to introduce, right, all the ideas of hell having been created by God, right, so that we understand that there is the ultimate creator, right? But then also, in a way, for us to remind us, as Dante always wants to, that it's his creation, right? So it's also, right, we have to remember and always step back from the poem. It's true, if it doesn't work in this literal level, as you're saying, right, for the actual inhabitants or those who are arriving, then it's really a part of the artifice of the poem itself. I see it, in these different ways, and I like to think of cowardice especially as something that the pilgrim is going through personally, right? Because that's all, Inferno 2 is all about the pilgrim's fear, right? And we have the word for cowardice there, viltà, all over the place. And then it's brought in again here. Okay, Dante, you know, as Virgil says, you can't be a coward anymore. And then we meet the cowards, right? So it's always this sort of forecasting, right? This foreshadowing of whom we're about to encounter, but also the idea that the pilgrim himself embodies a lot of the sins, right, or spiritual states of the inhabitants that he encounters along the way. So I feel like it's a, you know, it works into the narrative in different ways for us. How about for you?
Well, listening to what you were saying, that we are very much in the beginning of this narrative. After the first canto, Dante, at the very end of the first canto, Dante declares his readiness to follow Virgil and to enter hell and to see the afterlife. Then in second canto, he steps back a moment. He wonders if he has the virtù to undertake this voyage, thinking about the precedents of Aeneas and St. Paul before him. And then Virgil explains Beatrice's visit to him in limbo, summoning Virgil to be Dante's guide. And so at the end of Inferno 2, he makes the same vow that he did at the end of Inferno 1, but in a considerably enlightened state. And then getting to the beginning of Inferno 3, after he sees the gate, which curiously, Dante is reading it at the same time that readers of the poem are reading. It's unusual. I agree with your earlier point that the gate perhaps is for readers as a reminder that it is through this place, per me, that one enters a place of eternal pain, of eternal suffering. And Virgil, assuming his role as guide, but in a much more hierarchical way, because it's the beginning of the voyage, must steel Dante, who has to be reminded of how stalwart he must be, and that he must leave behind every cowardice. He had already showed some cowardice in the previous canto, and such an emotion is inappropriate for one who's going to visit hell.
Right. Yeah, no, there's so much right there, right at the beginning, right? And then we have their contrapasso, which is all very, very, very suggestive, right? The idea of the empty banner that they're chasing, which, you know, for us, you know, I think about it and I think about the fact that, you know, we have all these political manifestations and, you know, different protests and demonstrations. And, you know, you see everybody with sometimes, very often, with the words, right, that have been inspired by Dante's idea of cowardice, right, that neutrality is not an option, right, in times of moral crisis. There they are written with this banner. And for me, it always, you know, it makes me do a double take, because I think of the fact that the actual punishment of the cowards, right, the actual textual source for that idea that we're seeing on the play cards is actually, you know, there's an empty banner. There are no words, right? Which I always think is a neat, right, dissonance between what is happening in the poem and then what happens and how we interpret it now. But it's a very unique contrapasso, this idea, right, as I think, as you and I have been talking before, of just sort of chasing emptiness, right? It can also remind us of Brunetto Latini, seeming, right, at the end of Inferno 15, seeming to be chasing after, right, the drappo, you know, going for the drappo verde, the green cloth, right? I don't know, what else does it evoke for you, the contrapasso, the very literal one of them, of the souls chasing this empty banner?
I'm struck primarily by the fact that the banner has no insignia at all. You mentioned how in protests today, the most obvious ones we might think of are Black Lives Matter. And at times, protesters, because they're protesting in the era of COVID, are told not to shout, not to open their mouths, to keep the masks on, and to put what they stand for on signs. So we all know what they stand for. But these neutrals, these cowardly neutrals, these pusillanimous souls stood for nothing. They stood on the sidelines of life. Who we find here are the fallen angels. These are the angels, not the angels who followed Satan in his rebellion against God, but the angels, the cowardly angels who just stood on the sidelines waiting to see who was going to be the victor and didn't take a stand at all. Later in the poem, we learn that unbaptized infants are also here, but Dante is focused, the attentions are focused on the cowardly individuals themselves. And even, before that, as Virgil is stealing Dante, we see the pilgrim's initial response, his finding the message on the gate of hell very forbidding. The meaning, he says, is dark to him. And then upon entering, he hears this horrible sound of suffering, but it's not one suffering. If the gate says, per me si va nella città dolente, what Dante, the pilgrim, experiences as soon as he enters are the sounds of hell. And it's every manner of suffering. There's the wailing, crying, there's blasphemy, the beating of hands, showing this is a gesture betokening desperation. And Dante is so overwhelmed by this cacophony that he compares it to someone being caught in a whirling sandstorm. And it's just a brilliant image, because another thing I really like about this canto, and all cantos, are the effectiveness and the concision of Dante's comparisons that help the reader imagine the unimaginable, but he does so by choosing comparisons, whether it's a swirling sandstorm or melting wax or ivy clinging to a vine, or even two pans propped up against one another. These very sometimes ordinary images describe the most extraordinary phenomena.
Right, right. And it's, yes, absolutely. I mean, and another thing that you've brought up there, this idea that it's a multitude of sins. So there's a really large population, right, of the neutrals who are here put together with the neutral angels. And this is a completely new invention, right, on Dante's part. So in no other, right, and, visions of hell, do we have the neutral angels put together with cowardly souls, which really also for me, in terms of one of the important points about this canto that sticks out for me, speaks out to how much this was important for Dante, right? That, in a way, he's foregrounding this group. He has a real issue with cowardice, and he has a real issue for those who are cowards, though he never specifically names one of them, right? So they're a huge anonymous mass, right, of people. But then the pilgrim sees one person, right? Colui che fece il gran rifiuto. And it's that person that then makes the pilgrim understand who this group is, what they sinned in, for lack of a better term, because it's not necessarily a sin, right? Cowardice. And, obviously everyone has interpreted who is the colui, right? Is it Pontius Pilate? Was it, Celestine V, who then abdicated and made way for Pope Boniface VIII to come in? But this idea that it's here at the beginning of hell, in a way, because it's so important for Dante, right? So is it someone who didn't act politically or in the civic, arena, right? If we think about the two figures that we just mentioned between Pontius Pilate and Celestine V, is it because of the fact that their lack of action within history had a large ripple effect upon a broader population and upon the unfolding of history itself? There's so many questions that are raised by the gaps that the poet leaves within the canto. I don't know. What do you think about that? Have you always leaned towards one interpretation of that person or the other, or do you accept the ambiguity?
I guess I tend to go with the commentary tradition, and the majority of commentators and critics believe that Dante had in mind Celestine V, who was the Pope before the very hated Boniface VIII, Dante's great antagonist in the Commedia. But it is striking earlier what you said, and that is the anonymity of these souls. Virgil simply says, guarda e passa. They're not even worth your attention. Dante, of course, just being very early on in the journey, is anxious to engage with the souls, but they're not deserving of his attention, of anyone's attention. And that gives us a sense of just how harsh Dante views neutrality, that though the sin is punished in this entryway, this vestibule of hell, the punishment is horrendous. And if one thinks of it, it's not just that they're chasing a banner, they're being mercilessly stung by all manner of disgusting insects, wasps, mosquitoes, and everything. And it actually gets even more disgusting, because as they're being stung, the blood from their faces mingles with the tears, they're crying, that show their suffering, and all of this just drips down into some gross puddle at the bottom of their feet as they continue to run after the banner. But I know you've written on this canto, and I wonder if you might just have some thoughts on wherein cowardice lies, what constitutes cowardly action, how might we understand cowardice more generally?
Well, I think that, Dante talks about cowardice in the Convivio as, and he talks specifically about the cowardly soul as being the soul that has sort of not reached, and I'm paraphrasing here, obviously, sort of not reached their full potential. They have not acted, right, to the extent that they could act. And that's what we get in the Convivio. I think that what we get in Inferno 3 is a very politicized reading of it, right? But I think you have to go deep into the text and see connections with other cantos to come up with that. However, the idea of, not acting within the political sphere is the way that I've always read it. Perhaps my interpretation is being influenced by how often, we refer to, or politicians, right, and priests, pastors in their sermons use some sort of version of the idea of neutrality, right, as being the worst possible state when it's a time of political or moral crisis. And you have written about that with JFK. So I'm wondering if you would like to add anything about that insofar as, where JFK is getting it from.
Well, I didn't even know this, because what I learned, I initially found out that JFK thought for Kennedy, Dante was his favorite author. His brother said that, and others said that Dante was his favorite author. And JFK was particularly struck by what he thought Dante said, and that is that the darkest places in hell are reserved for those who in a time of moral crisis remain neutral. And this thought really resonated with him. There's some, before saying how the former president used the soul, it's important to think about just how different his conception of neutrality is from Dante's. Whereas Dante punishes the neutrals in the entryway of hell, Kennedy thought that the neutrality was punished in the darkest places of hell. Sometimes the quote is slightly varied to the hottest places in hell. Nevertheless, those who believe that Dante punished neutrality very much lower in hell shows that they considered neutrality to be a far graver sin than Dante does. And they also add the component of a moral crisis. So this goes back to what you were saying, that we tend to condemn those who are neutral today, and it still persists as an attitude, more those in a sort of a social political sphere. But for Kennedy, he was the author of Profiles in Courage, and was very skeptical about the English initially and their neutrality at an early point before engaging in World War II. But when Kennedy was a senator, he quoted this version of "the darkest places in hell are reserved for those who in time of moral crisis remain neutral," primarily to goad the Eisenhower administration for their neutrality in the face of the French-Algerian War. Kennedy, alone among American presidents, was one of the very first to show sympathy for the peoples of the Middle East. And others have quoted his version. Martin Luther King knew Kennedy, and it's possible that's where he picked it up, but he uses it famously at the beginning of his anti-Vietnam speech. And I think you've found other examples where it's used more recently, right?
Well, yeah, Martha Nussbaum uses it in one of her reviews of Judith Butler's book. It's you know, it gets used in various forms, but I've been finding also very interesting the history that you're alluding to, that you've uncovered there with JFK, but also, you know, in the 19th century, it being used at the time of the Civil War, right, by those who were aligned with the Union and so forth. This idea that, you know, neutrality at that point was not an option really puts the pressure on whoever is listening to that speech to take a side, right? So it's a very judgmental pronouncement that it's become. And I find that afterlife really fascinating. Well, it's been wonderful talking with you, Deborah, about Inferno 3. And I'm wondering, is there anything else that you would like to add? Anything else that sticks out for you about this canto?
Well, in teaching the Inferno, students often wonder, why is Dante's hell so full of figures from classical mythology? And in this canto, we have the ferryman of the damned Charon, we have the Acheron River, and I usually just explain that Dante is working within a literary tradition. He was a great admirer of Virgil. Virgil had written about the afterlife himself in book 6 of the Aeneid. And I love the way this canto both looks back to earlier literary traditions, figures from the classical hell, as well as reverberates into the future, even in something as small as another simile that's used here, and that is the way the damned fall into Charon's boat is compared to falling autumn leaves. Dante picks that simile up from Virgil, who himself had adapted it from Homer, and then after Dante, Milton picks it up, and even Shelley. So it has a long literary life, and I just love the way the canto has these echoes both back in time and project forward as well, when other readers and admirers of Dante pick up on it.
Right. No, it's an incredibly significant canto, and for all
you?
of these multiple reasons. Yes. So it's been wonderful talking with you about this canto. There's still so much to say, but we hope that our listeners here have gotten a sense of some of the very important themes and topics and issues that are raised by Inferno 3. And thank you again, Deborah. Nice talking with you.
Yes, thank you, Kristina. And you listeners out there, have your own lively conversations about Dante.
Great. Take care.